Let's talk about the moon split.
The hour has come closer and the moon has split.
Then they saw a miracle, but they turned away and said, "Old magic."
They disbelieved, followed their opinions, and adhered to their old traditions.
Sufficient warnings have been delivered to alert them.
Great wisdom, but all the warnings have been in vain.
Surah 54, the moon. It tells us a story of how the moon split. This is understood to have occurred during the time of Muhammad. But did it really? The Hadith, the Sirah, the scholars, the Tafsir, the eyewitness testimonies, the Quran, NASA, world effects, all to be considered.
Can we say any of the companions were true eyewitnesses, despite not having anything from them except for faulty oral traditions?
What about the cracks on the moon? What could have caused those?
Or the Indian king that converted to Islam due to the moon split?
The Quran's telling us the moon split, so this had to have been accomplished by Muhammad during his time, right?
They say, how come no miracle came down to him from his Lord? Say, the future belongs to God, so wait, and I am waiting along with you. What stopped us from sending the miracles is that the previous generations have rejected them. For example, we showed Thamud the camel, a profound miracle, but they transgressed against it. We sent the miracles only to instill reverence.
Wait, why is the Quran saying the Prophet's miracle was the Quran and nothing else?
The moon splitting, shooting water from his fingers, stopping the sun, controlling the rain. He didn't do any of it?
Is it not enough of a miracle that we sent down to you this book, being recited to them? This is indeed a mercy and a reminder for people who believe.
In this episode, we'll not only tackle the traditional narrative of chapter 54, verse 1, but we'll look into the chains of transmissions to what the tradition considers eyewitness testimonies, as well as other arguments posed.
If we take the affirmative stance and say that Muhammad split the moon, we need to find out if this alleged miracle was an event that the whole world could witness as proof of his prophethood, or if this was only a localized miracle. We'll explore both. But let's start with the position that it was a world event that anyone could have witnessed if they were watching the sky that night. Individuals like Sheikh Uthman claim a king in India witnessed the moon split during the time of Muhammad, hence his eventual conversion to Islam. The story is found within the book Muhammad Rasulullah by Muhammad Hamidullah. The story claimed the king converted, visited the Prophet, and traveled back home, but died in Oman where his tomb is visited. If we look at the bigger picture, we see that there was a large influx of Indians to Oman, which may provide further backing for this story. But when we look into this deeper, the historical research that was done on the story concluded that the story was definitely fictitious. The story of Cheraman Perumal, the Indian king who witnessed the splitting of the moon and converted to Islam, is a fabricated legend crafted to legitimize the early Islamic presence in India. Historical research, including that found in Monsoon Islam, demonstrates that this account was woven into existence as a way to strengthen the ties between South Indian rulers and the spread of Islam via Muslim merchants on the Malabar coast. This story, portraying Cheraman Perumal's conversion after witnessing a miracle performed by Prophet Muhammad, does not appear in contemporary historical records. Instead, it aligns with a broader strategy used by Muslim communities to establish their religious authority in non-Muslim lands. The narrative conveniently links the Prophet Muhammad to a South Indian king, providing a divine endorsement for Islam's expansion in the region. The fabrication of this tale served a clear purpose. It connected Muslim traders to local political power and portrayed Islam's presence as ordained by a miraculous event, thereby granting legitimacy to their religious and commercial activities. The legend helped embed Islam within the local culture, blending the region's history with Islamic religious authority. As outlined in Monsoon Islam, such stories were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger pattern of Islamic expansion that relied on myth-making to solidify its presence in foreign societies. Dr. Pranch says on page 95, In other words, there was no Chera king during the time of Muhammad who could have relinquished his throne to meet the Prophet. And the end of unified Chera rule, stylized in the tradition as the king's division of his realm prior to his departure for Mecca, only occurred in the 12th century. Moreover, critical epigraphical studies by scholars such as MGS Narayanan and Elam Kunjan Pillai have shown that Cheraman Perumal was not the name of a specific king, but a generic title meaning Great Lord of the Cheras. Even though the story of the convert king is a fabricated one, this doesn't stop Muslim apologists from pushing it out.
Cheraman Perumal witnessed the splitting of the moon of the Prophet ﷺ from his palace in southern India.
All the information about the kings of India and what happened during that time frame have been accepted through such reports. So this collaborated by the eyewitness accounts in the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that are no doubt verified, show clear evidence.
What does it say? It says that this incident was observed by the king of Malabar in Shakrawati Farnus.
Although to be fair, some have realized the truth in its fabrication.
Now, I know that some of you seem to believe that there was some sort of 7th century manuscript about an Indian king witnessing the moon splitting. However, that is an unreliable manuscript. It was written in Arabic, it's quite late, it contains anachronisms, so no, that wouldn't be good evidence of that happening.
Adherents to the belief that this was a world phenomenon would need evidence external to the Islamic tradition to verify the moon had split during the 7th century. In the mid-7th century, the Eastern Roman Empire had approximately 10,050,000 inhabitants. The Sassanid Empire had approximately 8 million inhabitants. Calculating the approximate population of East Africa is hard to decipher due to the limited sources, but we can estimate roughly 1 million if we combine the estimated population of the Aksumite Kingdom, as well as the various tribal societies within all of East Africa. Within Arabia itself, the population would have been roughly 2 million people. When we combine all of the various societies around the world who would have seen the event, would be at a minimum of about 15 million people. The idea that not a single individual documented such an event is unfathomable. Even if we were to claim that half of them were asleep during such an event, that still leaves approximately 7.5 million people feeling the need not to document such an event. The consequences of such an event would also be catastrophic on Earth. As Dr. Jonathan McDowell, an astrophysicist at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics in Massachusetts, says,
"It's interesting to think about, like, if we did have two halves of the moon up in the sky, probably on at least slightly differently timed orbits, that would look completely crazy, right?"
It would change everything on Earth, and from the point of view of, how much light is reflected off the moon. When we look up at the sky, sometimes you have a very bright moon, so now it's going to be smaller. Maybe the surface will change, so the reflection will change as well. It could play havoc with our tides, right? So the moon is very important to the tides of all the lakes and rivers and oceans. So now you have half, should we say, is half the original moon, so it has half the effect on the Earth, on the tidal forces. And now you have two of them. So now, instead of having like the maximum tide once every 24 hours, you're going to have tides going maximum when each half of the moon goes around a certain location. Maybe that will make the waves larger. Maybe it will make the tides more erratic. Who knows what will happen.
That seems bad for life.
It's complicated, right?
The consequences of cracking the moon open would be fairly destructive overall. It could create a fiery rain of lunar fragments with the potential to end life on Earth, and the moon's influence on the tides would change drastically. So not only did 0 out of potentially 7.5 million people refuse to document a moon split, but even if we suppose such a split occurred, the impact on Earth would be tidal changes, debris, impact of moon fragments from the split, orbital instability, climate effects, molten fluid outer core spill, and other effects Dr. McDowell emphasized. Now, if we've eliminated the possibility of it being a worldwide miracle, we can now investigate the claims of it being a localized miracle. This would then require us to look into the Hadith Corpus and see all the various claims. Now, Sheikh Uthman made a weird claim in his video. He claimed we had eyewitness testimonies within the corpus of Hadith from individuals like Ibn Abbas, Ibn Masud, Anas ibn Malik, Al-Aswad ibn Yazid, Jubair ibn Mut'im, and others. In order to validate this, we need to understand what an eyewitness account really is. When a person witnesses an event and testifies directly about it, this constitutes an eyewitness account. This is not what we have within the Hadith Corpus. Let's use a practical example. If a man named Jim robs a bank and a man named Mark witnesses the robbery, seeing Jim's face clearly, Mark is an eyewitness. In court, Mark can testify, Yes, I witnessed Jim robbing the bank. Now, if Mark tells a trusted friend, who tells another trusted friend, and so on, none of these individuals can be considered eyewitnesses except for Mark himself. Even if they say, my friend Mark told so-and-so, who told so-and-so, who told so-and-so, that he witnessed Jim robbing the bank, this does not make them eyewitnesses. This is precisely what happens with isnads in hadith literature. People claim that individuals in the chain of transmission can relay an alleged testimony from Ibn Masud and present it as first-hand testimony. Unless we have text dating back to the period of Ibn Masud with verification that he himself claimed to have witnessed the moon splitting, we cannot assert that we have eyewitness testimonies. Therefore, without direct, contemporaneous text from Ibn Masud, the claim of having eyewitness testimonies is fundamentally flawed. This situation is similar to the Christian tradition concerning the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The Apostle Paul claimed that over 500 people witnessed the resurrected Christ one. However, we do not have direct testimonies from these individuals themselves. Instead, we rely on Paul's account, which is a secondary source. Just as with the isnads in hadith literature, the absence of direct, contemporaneous testimonies from these 500 witnesses means we cannot consider them first-hand accounts. The reliability of such claims depends heavily on the trustworthiness of the intermediary sources, but they do not equate to direct eyewitness testimony. Before we go through the isnads, we must consult the biographical seerah material. As Dunbol points out in his encyclopedia of canonical hadith, Ibn Ishaq neglected to mention the splitting of the moon in his seerah. He says on page 518, quote, "It is surely unthinkable that the compiler of the Seerah Ibn Ishaq, who died some 10 years before Shuba, Ibn al-Hajjaj, would neglect to record a miracle allegedly worked by Muhammad if he had heard of it." If Ibn Ishaq, who was commissioned during the Abbasid period to collect traditions pertaining to Muhammad's life, approximately 150 years after the Prophet's time, had known of the event of the moon splitting, he would have included it in his compilation. Ibn Ishaq meticulously gathered various stories with their respective chains of transmission and compiled them into a comprehensive work. However, none of the existing recensions of his works mention the event of the moon splitting. This absence is significant. If such a miraculous event had been widely known and transmitted, it is highly unlikely that Ibn Ishaq would have omitted it. Therefore, the fact that his compilation does not include this event suggests that the story either did not exist during his time or was not widely transmitted enough to reach him. This implies that the narrative of the moon splitting likely emerged after Ibn Ishaq's demise or was not considered significant enough to be included in his collection. Let's look into the different bundles of hadith regarding the moon split. The first bundle of narrations is that of the 5 things that have passed, narrated Abdullah. 5 things have passed: Al-Lizam, the defeat of the Romans, the mighty grasp, the splitting of the moon, and the smoke. Now, this hadith doesn't mention the Prophet splitting the moon. It simply states that one of the events that have passed was the splitting of the moon, which one could conclude by simply reading Surah 54, verse 1 of the Quran. When we diagram these narrations and their variants, we see Muslim Ibn Subai, also known as Abu al-Duha, as the Kufan common link of the tradition. We have a separate chain that goes from Ibn Masud to Al-Qama, to Ibrahim, to Urfuta, to Al-Walid ibn Abad, to Ismail ibn Ayash, to Abu al-Jumahir, to Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Yahya. When we look up the biographical material, we notice that Ismail ibn Ayash is a suspicious character, even within the tradition itself. Bukhari said, Ismail is a denier of hadith from the people of the Hijaz and the people of Iraq. Ahmad ibn Hanbal said, what he narrated from the Levantines is correct, and what he narrated from the people of the Hijaz is not correct. He is not reliable, especially if he narrates from the people of the Hijaz. Not authentic, not recognized. If he narrates from the people of the Hijaz, he is not recognized. Al-Bayhaqi said, Al-Bukhari and a group of scholars also said this. Ismail ibn Ayash is a kufan, similarly to all the other red blocks on the screen. It's plausible Ismail received this narration as a kufan from other kufans near him, who were also hadith transmitters, and committed tadlays with a false isnad back to Ibn Masud to serve as independent confirmation for this hadith. This would mean that this narration can only go back to Muslim Ibn Subai, who died in the year 701 AD. It seems that this hadith served as exegesis for chapter 54, verses 1 through 3. Considering it doesn't claim that Muhammad split the moon, we can surmise that Muslim provided exegesis on prophecies within the Quran, such as the smoke in chapter 44, the moon splitting in chapter 54, the Roman prophecy in chapter 30, the Al-Lizam in chapter 25, and the mighty grasp also in chapter 44. The next bundle goes from Jubair to his son Muhammad to Hussein, and from there the hadiths proliferate. Similarly to the previous bundle, this narration can reliably go back to the common link of a Kufan narrator. In this case, it's Hussein ibn Abdurrahman, who died in 756 AD. This is the earliest transmission of Muhammad himself splitting the moon. There's a separate transmission from Musa ibn Umayyah to Ali ibn Sa'id. Similarly to the last bundle, this one serves as independent confirmation back to Ibn Mas'ud. This chain is extremely deficient considering Musa ibn Umayyah died in 141 Hijri, and Ali ibn Sa'id died in 241 Hijri. If we make the assumption that Ali was born 10 years before Musa died to receive the transmission in 131, then that would mean that Ali received the tradition at 10 years old, transmitted it, and died at the age of 118. This isn't possible. The gap between Musa and Ali is just way too large to be considered a valid chain. It's likely that Ali got the hadith from Abdullah or other Kufan narrators and made a fake isnad back to Ibn Mas'ud to serve as independent confirmation for the bundle. In actuality, Hussein ibn Abdurrahman is the only person we can track this hadith to. Tracking it back further is simply wishful thinking, considering we don't have any independent confirmation of this narration. This bundle is built upon the trust on this one Kufan narrator. This next set of hadith transmissions can get a bit complicated, so I'll take it step by step to make it easier to follow. We start with a group of transmissions, all tracing back to Ibn Abbas. At first glance, the text of all these transmissions appears identical, except for one version, which goes from Ibn Abbas to Ikrimah and then down to Ahmad bin Amr. In the transmissions, such as Bukhari, 2 transmissions, Mustadrak al-Hakim, Tabarani, 2 transmissions, and Sahih Muslim, the text is the same. However, this one version claims to also trace back to Ibn Abbas, but differs in its text. The majority of the transmissions lead back to Bakr ibn Munda. This isnad can be reliably traced to him or his Egyptian counterpart, Jafar ibn Rabi'a. However, beyond Bakr, it's essentially a single chain transmission, making it questionable without independent confirmation. Now, for the other isnad, if we consult the experts in Ilm al-Rijal, we find that Muhammad ibn Bakr received hadith from 2 notable figures, Shuba ibn al-Hajjaj and Sa'id ibn Abu Aruba. The version of the text they transmit is very similar to the one Muhammad ibn Bakr transmits. Given Muhammad ibn Bakr's known connection to these 2 individuals, it's more likely that he received his version of the hadith from them, rather than directly through the isnad leading back to Ibn Abbas. The similarity in the text supports this conclusion. This then leads us to our Basran sources. We have 4 partial common links. We have Shuba ibn al-Hajjaj, Sa'id ibn Abu Aruba, Shayban, and Abdurrazzaq. All of them are claiming to have received their narration from Qatada. I don't believe this is accurate, and I will explain why. The text that Shuba has varies with what Sa'id and Shayban has. In fact, Sa'id and Shayban seem to have identical metiyen. If we look at the blue text boxes, in all of them it mentions specifically the Meccans requesting a miracle, which led to the Prophet giving a miracle. This is the case for all of the blue box texts. This would mean Shayban, Sa'id, and Abdurrazzaq received their narration from a common source. Shuba's narration is more of a summary, by mentioning that the moon had split during the time of the messenger. There's a reason to believe that Qatada wasn't actually the source of Shayban, Sa'id's, and Abdurrazzaq's transmission. It's plausible that they received the real text from Shuba, their Basran counterpart, who received it from Al-Aʿmash, a Kufan common link that we will look at in a moment. Yunbal says the following about Qatada on page 473 of his Encyclopedia of Canonical Hadith. He is recorded in Mez in more than 300 prophetic traditions, with a strand from Anas, which entitles him to be called a successor, but in none can he conceivably be considered to have been the originator of the Maytiyen, or the strand back to the Prophet for that matter. When we find a Qatada, Sash, Anas, Prophet strand, it is safer to attribute it to the transmitters who reportedly pass on the Matiyen from Qatada. Various figures transmitting the Anas material from Qatada are the most likely candidates for having brought it into circulation. As Junbol explained, Qatada is not viewed as the originator of the content in the transmission. Instead, the actual responsibility for the text lies with the other figures who transmitted it from Qatada. He suggests that these other transmitters who circulated the hadith attributed to Qatada's transmission from Anas are the ones more likely responsible for bringing the hadith into widespread circulation. If we read further into page 473 and the early part of 474, it states it was Shuba who was instrumental in tying Qatada's name to Anas, whereby Sa'id ibn Abi Aruba, Hisham ad-Dastuwa'i, Hammam ibn Yahya, and Hammam ibn Salama are the most frequent transmitters making dives for Shuba's informant. Junbol emphasized that it was Shuba who played a pivotal role in associating Qatada with Anas, a prominent companion of the Prophet. This suggests that Shuba tied Qatada's transmission to Anas's name, effectively creating the Qatada-Anas prophet chain. Shuba wasn't the only key figure though. Other transmitters like Sa'id ibn Abi Aruba, who appears as a partial common link for us, Hisham ad-Dastuwa'i, Hammam ibn Yahya, and Hammam ibn Salama were frequently involved in transmitting hadiths that came through Shuba's informants. This means that these individuals took the information they received, likely through Shuba, and further propagated it, ensuring that Qatada's transmission from Anas became well circulated. In short, Shuba and the group of frequent transmitters connected to him were critical in the wider dissemination of hadiths that originated from Qatada, particularly those attributed to Anas. These transmitters were responsible for solidifying Qatada's link to Anas and spreading those hadiths, which is why Junbol stresses that the responsibility for the transmission lies with them rather than with Qatada himself. So, to summarize, Shuba is the originator of this tradition. He gave this narration to Sa'id, Shayban, and Abdurrazzaq, considering their narrations are literally the same transmission, as if they copied each other, and fabricated chains to Qatada with a connection to Anas. Junbol says about Abdurrazzaq bin Hammam, a Mawla who settled in Yemen. He brought into circulation large numbers of traditions, which he copied from earlier common links after providing them with isnad strands of his own making. Ibn Hajar is said to have confirmed that Azraqi told him himself that he was born in 126. If Abdurrazzaq is known for fabricating isnads, but collected his text from other sources, it's evident that he took the Matiyen from Shuba and fabricated an isnad to Qatada and Anas. Considering they all cite the same source, this must have been a coordinated effort on behalf of Shuba. But where did Shuba get his narration from? He got it from Al-Aʿmash, but we'll look at that bundle after the next one. The last bundle is extremely short, only 2 transmissions, and they are essentially stating the same thing. The trace back to a Kufan common link, Israel ibn Yunus. In the books of Ilm al-Rijal, it's noted that Israel bin Yunus heard from Suleiman al-Aʿmash during his lifetime. It's likely that Israel committed tadlis by taking this narration from his Kufan counterpart, Al-Aʿmash, and created a false isnad back to Al-Aswad. The next bundle has a connection to a second bundle, but we'll start with the Ibn Masud / Al-Aʿmash bundle. In this one, Al-Aʿmash is very distinctly the common link of this tradition. They all pretty much share the same hadith, shown in the green boxes. Earlier we figured out that the Basran narrations trace back to Shuba, falsifying fake isnads to Qatada as a seemingly common link. But we needed to figure out where Shuba got his narration. It becomes clear that he gets his tradition from Al-Aʁmash, who is the common link of this tradition. So to tie up loose ends, we see that Al-Aʁmash transmits this hadith to the Basran scholar Shuba, who then tells Sa'id ibn Abu Aruba and Shayban, with Abdurrazzaq picking it up and making his own isnad to the same source. And they all trace back their narration to Qatada, when in reality they got it from Shuba. Now we know Shuba's source is Al-Aʿmash. It's also important to look at Sufyan ibn Uyayna. He is a Kufan transmitter who receives this narration from Al-Aʿmash. If we look at this bundle, we see that this bundle that goes from Ibn Abu Naji to Ibn Uyayna is just the same narration as the Al-Aʿmash narration. When we consult what Dribble says about Sufyan on page 579, Sufyan was mentioned in connection with the suspicion of Tadlis, but it was never held against him in such a way that his transmissions were no longer acceptable. Sufyan bore the honorific Shaykh al-Islam. As could be distilled from Münz, he borrowed extensively from Shuba's and Malik's traditions, which he then provided, sometimes with diving spiders or SS's onto their bundle, or he superimposed strands of his own making. They were among the most important hadith colleagues he copied. We can tell from this that Sufyan copied many of Shuba's traditions and has a pattern of doing so. He does so in this specific case. The narrations he narrates in Bukhari, Nasa'i, and Musnad ibn Hanbal are the exact same of what is transmitted by Shuba from Al-Aʿmash. It is also the same of what Sufyan transmits from Al-A�mash, which would make it equally as likely that Sufyan took the hadith he got from Al-A�mash and posited false isnads to Ibn Abu Naji. Now the single strand from Ibn Abu Naji to Muhammad ibn Muslim to Abdurrazzaq to Ishaq ibn Ibrahim and so on is the same Basran hadith we went over earlier with the blue box. We also see that it's the same narrators, Ishaq ibn Ibrahim and Abdurrazzaq. It becomes clear that the isnad from Ibn Abu Naji is false and that this was likely the doing of Abdurrazzaq or Ishaq ibn Ibrahim, falsifying an isnad through another companion instead of citing their true source, Shuba. At this point, we can only date this back to Al-A�mash. Like we mentioned earlier, dating this earlier to him would be uncritical and just not feasible, considering we don't have legitimate independent attestation of this narration without going through Al-A�mash. To summarize the transmission history, it initially started out as simple exegesis, to a gradual change to Muhammad having a miracle. It started out as a Kufan narration and spread to Basra via Shuba with a false isnad back to Anas ibn Malik. This is a good explanation how a hadith may seem to be mutawatir when it really isn't. Al-A�mash received this hadith, claiming to have chains to Ibn Masud, companion number 1. Shuba received this hadith from Al-A�mash and created false isnads to another companion, Anas ibn Malik, companion number 2. Israel received the hadith from Al-A�mash and created a false isnad to another companion, companion 3, Al-Aswad. Bakr received this second hand from Shuba, who got it from Al-A�mash and faked an isnad to Ibn Abbas, companion 4. One of the earliest fabrications came from Hussein, who fabricated a chain to Jubayr, companion 5, with Sufyan, who got the hadith from Al-A�mash and Shuba and faked it to Ibn Umar, companion 6. A Kufan creation to a widespread mutawatir hadith that Ibn Ishaq managed to skip out. This would mean the fabrication must have occurred after the creation of the Sierra. So the reason why Ibn Ishaq never placed the moon-splitting miracle in his seerah, despite it being allegedly witnessed by all of these companions, is because it hadn't existed yet. The Kufan fabricators of the tradition created the narration post-seerah in order to explain what chapter 54 verse 1 is saying when the moon has split. This was likely created in an environment where people are reading Surah 54 and are asking about the context. Thus, the creation of a supernatural miracle for Muhammad was born in Kufa, where it was massively spread through Al-A�mash, with fake isnads going back to various companions. The Quran explicitly states that people questioned Muhammad on why he didn't have a miracle in 1020, and his response was, "The future belongs to God, so wait, and I am waiting along with you." This verse was revealed after the verse of the moon split in Surah 54 verse 1. If Muhammad had split the moon prior, he could have referenced his miracle, or better yet, it would have been already known considering its alleged mutawatir status. The same goes for Surah 29 verse 50, where Quraysh says, "If only miracles could come down to him from his Lord." Muhammad replied, "All miracles come only from God. I am no more than a manifest warner." Again, he never refers to his moon-splitting miracle. The reason is because he never had one. This lines up with Brokop's point, where he states, quote, "The foregoing discussion has detected a progression from signs to miracles, from eschatology to history, from the figurative description to the literal one. These levels add up to the transformation of Muhammad from a human messenger to a supernatural hero." This process was the result of the popular need of the post-Quranic society for a hero with whom one could identify even after the death of the historical Muhammad. Muhammad could become the needed hero thanks to the historical victories that he had won together with his companions. The military achievements in Medina after the Hijrah and the successful spread of Islam outside of Arabia enabled the Prophet to go on living in the minds of the devoted believers as a new Muhammad, a person blessed with powers that he still lacked in the Quran and that bridged the gap between him and the previous prophets. This new Muhammad was eventually read into the pre-Hijrah history of the Prophet, as seen in the exegesis of the moon passage. There he no longer has to apologize for being just a plain warner. With the miracles that God enables him to perform, he can meet any challenge and even make the moon split on demand. Let's summarize up until this point. None of the narrations can actually be considered as an eyewitness report. The narrations that appear mutawatir are actually Kufan fabrications that don't even appear in the Sirah of Ibn Ishaq. NASA scientists debunk the idea that the cracks on the moon refer to any moon-splitting event. An Indian king did not witness any moon split and convert, considering it's a fabricated account. The Quran states people questioned why Muhammad didn't have a miracle, despite Surah 54 having already been revealed prior when he could have flexed the moon splitting with its various attestations. If the moon had actually split, the chances that any of us would be alive to discuss today would be none, considering it would have destroyed Earth. Now, if chapter 54 verse 1 is not talking about Muhammad's moon-splitting miracle, then what is it talking about?
Apollo 11, this is the launch operations manager. The launch team wishes you good luck and Godspeed. Thank you very much. No, it'll be a good one. At 15 seconds, guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9, ignition sequence start.
On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong became the first person to step foot on the moon. A day later, at exactly 1:54 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, Apollo lunar module lifted off from the surface of the moon carrying 22 kilograms of lunar rock to be brought back to Earth, so it could be analyzed. One may ask, what does the Apollo 11 mission have anything to do with chapter 54, verse 1, a verse that was revealed over 1,400 years ago? Well, if we examine documents produced by NASA to see what time the Apollo 11 left the moon, it states it left the moon at exactly 1:54 p.m. More specifically, it details the exact second of the liftoff. 1:54:1 is the exact second that Apollo 11 lifted off from the surface of the moon with lunar rock, just as the prophecy in the Quran specified this would happen in chapter 54, verse 1. Now, some may argue that based on where a person was in the world, the hour of the departure would be represented differently. If we go with Eastern Daylight Time, as per the Kennedy Space Center located on Merritt Island, Florida, which was mission control for Apollo 11, we see that the time was 1:54 p.m. Using the classical 24-hour clock used worldwide, NASA's detailed logs conclude that the liftoff from the moon was at 17:54:01. This time perfectly matches the prophecy in 54:1. The moon split wasn't a miracle for Muhammad, but rather a prophecy for the future. The splitting referred to the rocks being brought back from the moon to Earth, hence the prophecy aligning with the departure time. Another point to consider: if we count the number of times the word moon is mentioned up until the moon-splitting prophecy, we get 21. From the moon-splitting prophecy until the end of the Quran, the word moon appears 7 times, which corresponds exactly to the date of the Apollo 11 departure. Thus, Not only does the time match the Quranic prophecy, but the date is also reflected in the Quran. Even after all that, if someone still claims that this is all coincidental, we can count the number of verses after the prophecy in 54:1 and get 1,389 verses until the end of the Quran. 1,389 Hijri lunar years is equivalent to 1969 solar years, which is the exact year the prophecy about the moon's departure and splitting occurred. The time to the exact second is prophesied in the Quran. The exact date is prophesied in the Quran. The exact year is prophesied in the Quran. If, after all that, one claims it's coincidental or just forcing a conclusion despite the time, date, and year being objective and unable to be manipulated, the Quran states the following after detailing the prophecy in 54:1.
In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful, the hour has come closer and the moon has split. Then they saw a miracle, but they turned away and said, "Old magic." They disbelieved, followed their opinions, and adhered to their old traditions. Sufficient warnings have been delivered to alert them. Great wisdom, but all the warnings have been in vain.
As you know, the name of the surah reflects the most important component in that chapter, and we find it in the first verse. It is one of the prophecies regarding the end of the world. When the hour approaches, the moon will split, and this prophecy already happened in the early 70s. You can go right now to Flandreau Observatory and see a piece of the moon there. So if this is not the splitting of the moon, I don't know what is. People think of the splitting of the moon like the moon would be two of them, or be cut in half. But the moon is split in that we went to the moon and we brought a ton or two of moon material. So this prophecy has been fulfilled.